The sound of raindrops hitting the tin rooftops of Bogotá's shantytowns was always the same. On rainy nights, the street kids would huddle under bridges, trying to squeeze themselves into damp cardboard boxes. Some of them still thought about mothers who'd long forgotten them, while others were just waiting for sunrise, ready to hit the streets again for a scrap of bread. But there was one man out there in the rain, holding a black umbrella and a cheap plastic bag full of sweets, looking for them. A man who, when he got close, smelled like cheap cologne and smiled. A man who said his name was Padre, a servant of God, and that he wanted to help. The kids thought he was an angel, but they were wrong. He was the devil, dressed in angel's clothes. This is the story of Luis Alfredo Garavito, a man who carved out a special, blood-soaked place in the history of Colombian, and maybe even global crime. A place written with the blood of 140 children. This story takes you straight back to the 70s, 80s, and 90s in Colombia, a time when civil war, drug trafficking, and crushing poverty turned the country into a living hell. A time when abandoned kids scattered through the streets like autumn leaves, and no one gave a damn about them. This is a story that shows how a human can turn into a monster, how pain can twist into hatred, and how a whole society can be too blind to see the nightmare unfolding right in front of it. In this story, you will hear how Luis wrestled with a pain that never really healed. From his childhood all the way to the last moments of his life. You'll see how a victim can morph into an executioner, and how kids who should have been Colombia's future had their lives ripped away in his hands. You'll hear how he tricked them, how he led them out into those lonely forests, and how in that pitch-black darkness, he did things too twisted to even imagine. Get ready for a story you won't ever forget. A story soaked in pain, rage, and darkness. A story told by a narrator. Yeah, but maybe, if you listen close enough, you'll catch the faint screams of those kids too. The ones that got swallowed up by the night. Luis Alfredo Garavito Cubillos was born on January 25, 1957, in the small town of Genova, Quindío, tucked away in the mountains. It was one of those quiet, sleepy towns where you'd think nothing ever really happens. But behind those closed doors, there were stories soaked in pain, stories no one dared to talk about. The Garavito family was one of those dark stories. Manuel Antonio Garavito, Luis's father, worked in the town's small factories and sometimes on the farms around it. He was a man who'd once had dreams when he was young, but life crushed every single one of them. Coming from a conservative, old-school family, he believed a man had to be tough, had to raise his kids with a firm hand, or in his case, with fists and belts. The problem was, Manuel's idea of tough was something way darker. He didn't punish his kids to teach them anything. He did it to dump out all the anger he didn't even understand himself. He'd whip off his belt and beat them until their cries died out. He'd yell, smash them against the wall, then go quiet, like nothing ever happened. Rosa Delia Cubillos, Luis's mom, was a woman who gave her whole life to keeping the house together. She had 7 kids, and with every new baby, Her hope for a better life faded a little more. Rosa was a religious woman. She prayed every single day, begging the Virgin Mary to protect her family. But prayers weren't enough. She couldn't stop her husband, couldn't save her kids from him. At night, when Manuel Antonio beat the children, Rosa would just sit in the kitchen and cry, but she never stepped in. Maybe she was scared. Maybe she thought that's just how life is. Or maybe she just didn't know what the hell to do. Luis was the fourth kid, not the oldest, so no special attention. Not the youngest, so no sweet affection either. In that house, he was one of those invisible middle kids, easy to overlook. From early on, he was quiet, withdrawn, while other kids on the block ran around, played, laughed. Luis mostly sat alone, staring at the ground. He learned real young that home wasn't a safe place. When his father got mad, anything in his way got broken. One time, Luis was just playing with his little sister when his dad walked in, grabbed him by the arm for no damn reason, and threw him straight into the wall. Luis didn't go to the hospital that day with his head cracked open and bleeding, 'cause Rosadelia was terrified the cops would find out. She just wrapped a rag around his head and told him to keep quiet. But the worst thing in Luis's life happened when he turned 8. One afternoon, his dad sent him to a neighbor's house to borrow something. That neighbor, around 40, was one of those guys who always seemed nice to kids, gave them candy, joked with them. Luis knocked on his door. The man smiled, said, "Come on in." Luis stepped inside. The house was dark. The curtains were shut tight. Smelled like cigarettes. The man said, "Wait here, I'll grab it real quick." Luis stood in the tiny yard, waiting. But the guy never came back. Then the door slammed. Luis turned around, and there were 2 more men. One of them was the neighbor's cousin. They grabbed him. Luis screamed, but one of them covered his mouth. He struggled, but he was just a kid, no match for grown men. They dragged him into this small, bare room with just a nasty old mattress in the corner. And there, those 3 men did something unspeakable to an 8-year-old boy. Luis screamed till his voice broke, cried till his eyes swelled, but nobody came. The pain, both the kind no kid should ever feel and the kind that never heals, stuck with him forever. When they were done, they threw him out on the street like trash. Beaten and bleeding, Luis dragged himself home. His mom saw him messed up, but only asked, "What happened?" He couldn't speak. He didn't even know how to say it. She didn't ask again. Just washed him, cleaned his clothes, told him to shut up. His dad came home later that night and didn't even notice. Something inside Luis broke that day, and it never got fixed. After that, he didn't play with the other kids anymore. He didn't talk. He'd sit for hours, staring at the wall. Nights were full of nightmares. Sweat, sudden wake-ups. Rosadelia thought he was just sick, gave him warm water and prayers. But Luis wasn't sick. He was shattered, and nobody saw the cracks. School wasn't any better. Luis was quiet, weak, the kind of kid bullies loved to crush. They left him alone in the yard, cursed at him, beat him. Teachers didn't care either. To them, he was just another face in a crowded classroom in Colombia. That's when Luis started stealing. At first, it was tiny stuff, pencils, erasers, then cash from his classmates. He didn't even know why. It just felt like taking back something that had been ripped away from him. When Luis turned 12, his dad found out he was stealing. That night, Manuel Antonio dragged him down to the basement, yanked off his belt, and beat him so bad he couldn't walk for a week. Rosadelia stayed silent again. Luis never went back to school after that. He made up his mind to run. One night, while everyone slept, he grabbed a couple of clothes, some hidden cash, and slipped out the door. He didn't know where he was headed. He just knew he couldn't stay. Luis spent a few months surviving on the streets of Genova. He met street kids, learned how to find food, how to dodge cops and creeps. He slept under bridges, carried groceries for coins. But one day the cops caught him and dragged him back home. His dad didn't say a word, just slapped him across the face and warned him never to run again. But Luis did run again. And this time, it was for good. Through his teen years, Luis drifted from town to town. Wherever he found work, that's where he crashed. Bogota, Cali, Medellin. He walked them all. He learned to switch up his look, his clothes, even his whole damn identity. Sometimes he was a salesman, sometimes a teacher, sometimes some charity guy. He learned how to talk to people, how to win their trust. And the biggest lesson of all, people trust a smile and a face, not a heart. But at the same time, something inside Luis was growing, something dark and dangerous. He started having fantasies. In his mind, he created images that were all about children. He imagined himself standing over a child, being in control, having power. He knew these thoughts were wrong, but he couldn't stop them. They grew stronger every day until they weren't just fantasies anymore. When Luis turned 23, he chose his first victim. He was in the city of Sevilla, a small town in southern Colombia. He saw a 10-year-old boy walking alone down the street. Luis walked up to him, smiled, and said, "Hey kid, are you lost?" The boy said no. Luis replied, "Do you want some ice cream?" The boy thought for a moment and said okay. Luis took him to a shop, bought him ice cream, and then said, "Let's go somewhere nice to play." The boy went with him. They left the city, heading down a dirt road, and there, Luis killed that boy. At night, he returned to the city as if nothing had happened. He went to sleep, and for the first time in years, didn't have nightmares. On the contrary, he felt calm, and that feeling of calm was the most dangerous thing of all, because it showed Luis that he wasn't the same person anymore. He had become a monster who needed to keep hunting. The years after that first murder were the years Luis sank deeper and deeper into darkness. He wasn't Luis Alfredo Garavito Cubillos anymore. He was 100 different faces, 100 different names. Sometimes he called himself Padre Alfonso, a kind priest who traveled around helping orphans. Sometimes he was Diste, a traveling salesman who was nice to kids. And sometimes he was just some regular guy claiming he could give street kids food, work, and a roof over their heads. He'd switch up his look all the time. Hats, glasses, fake mustaches, whatever he needed to blend in. And 1980s and 90s Colombia was the perfect hunting ground. Back then, the country was drowning in chaos. A brutal civil war between the government, left-wing guerrilla groups like FARC and ELN, and right-wing paramilitaries had turned the country into a battlefield. Drug cartels ran everything. Pablo Escobar and his rivals ruled like kings. Streets were filled with violence, murder, explosions, and kidnappings. And in all that chaos, nobody gave a damn about street kids. Thousands of children roamed the streets of Bogota, Cali, Medellin, and other cities. They had no families, or their families had thrown them out. They sniffed glue to forget the hunger, stole to survive, and slept in abandoned cars or under bridges at night. To the system, they didn't even exist. And that invisibility, Luis used it like a weapon. Whenever he entered a new city, he'd head straight for the central plazas, parks, bus terminals, and markets. Places where street kids hung out. He'd sit on a bench, maybe holding a book or a rosary, and just wait. After a while, one of the kids would come closer, maybe to beg, maybe just curious. Luis knew exactly how to talk to them. He had been one of them. He spoke their language. He knew what they wanted: food, safety, someone who gave a damn. And he promised them all of that. Sometimes he'd even hang around for a few days, be their friend. His first big victim was a boy named Juan Carlos, 12 years old, in the city of Sevilla. Juan Carlos had a mom who was addicted to drugs. His dad had walked out years ago. He lived on the streets, working at the market every morning, carrying bags, and sleeping under a bridge at night. One day, Luis saw him at the market. He walked up and said, "Kid, you work too hard. Want to get a better job?" Juan Carlos looked at him, unsure. Luis smiled and said, "I'm Padre Alfonso. I work for the church. We have a farm outside the city where kids can work, earn money, and live safely. You can come too." Juan Carlos hesitated, but he needed work. He needed money. How much? He asked. 10,000 pesos a week, Luis replied. Food and a place to stay, too. Juan Carlos agreed. Luis took him to the bus station. They got on a bus heading out of the city. Juan Carlos sat by the window, staring at the mountains, while Luis sat beside him, talking about the farm, how nice it was, how the other kids there were happy. Juan Carlos smiled. He thought his life was finally about to change. The bus stopped in a small village. Luis and Juan Carlos got off. Luis said, "The farm's a little further. We gotta walk." They started walking down a dirt road with trees closing in on both sides. The further they went, the narrower the road got. The thicker the trees became. Juan Carlos started feeling uneasy. He asked, "Padre, how much further?" Luis answered, "We're close. Just a little more, son." After half an hour of walking, they reached a dense forest. No more road, just trees and bushes. Juan Carlos stopped. "This isn't a farm," he said. Luis turned around. That same fake smile was still on his lips, but something in his eyes had changed. "Come on, son," he said softly. "Just a little further." Juan Carlos took a step back. He said, "No, I'm going back." But Luis moved fast, grabbed Juan Carlos's hand, and snapped, "Where you think you're going? I did you a favor. You gonna leave now?" Juan Carlos tried to pull away, but Luis held on tighter. He started dragging him into the woods. Juan Carlos screamed, "Let go! Help!" But there was nobody to hear. Luis dragged him until they hit a quiet spot where the trees were so thick, sunlight barely got through. He shoved Juan Carlos to the ground. The kid fell onto wet leaves and dirt, crying, begging, "Please, I didn't do anything. Let me go." Luis sat down, calm-like, pulled a rope from his bag, and said, "You know, kid, I waited years for this moment. I needed someone who'd trust me, who'd smile at me, who'd think I was saving them." Juan Carlos tried to crawl back, but Luis lunged, turned him over, and tied his hands behind his back. Juan Carlos screamed. Luis put his hand over his mouth and hissed, "Shh, calm down. If you're calm, it'll be over quicker." What happened next was horrific. Luis tortured Juan Carlos. He cut him with a knife, beat him, and assaulted him. Juan Carlos begged, "Please, stop. I'll give you money, whatever you want." But Luis just laughed. "What do you got to give me? You got nothing. You're nobody," he said. And when Luis decided it was enough, he looped the rope around Juan Carlos's neck and squeezed. Juan Carlos thrashed, flailed his arms, turned his head, but Luis kept tightening until the kid went still. Luis was breathing hard. He sat there for a few minutes and stared at the body. He'd expected fear, guilt, maybe disgust, but all he felt was calm, like something locked up inside him had been set free after years. He stood up, wiped his hands on Juan Carlos's clothes, dug a shallow hole, dumped the body in, covered it with dirt and leaves, and then walked away. He hitched a bus back to the village, then rode into the next town as if nothing had happened. Months passed, and nobody noticed. Juan Carlos's mother didn't even know where he was. She figured he'd gone off to another city, or maybe he'd just vanished. The police didn't file a report. Street kids disappeared all the time. That neglect is exactly what let Luis carry on. His second victim was a boy named Pablo, 10 years old, in the town of Ginebra. Pablo shined shoes in the plaza. One day this man, calling himself Manuel this time, asked him to shine his shoes. Pablo did. The man paid him more than usual and asked, "Want to work for me? I've got a shop, need a helper." Pablo asked what kind of work. "Simple packing," the man said. "Good pay." Pablo agreed. Luis took him out of town again, up into the hills. They walked down into a ravine. "Where's the shop?" Pablo asked. "Down the valley," Luis said. But when they reached the bottom, Pablo saw Luis pull a rope from his bag. He ran, but Luis was faster. He grabbed Pablo, threw him down, and tied his hands. Pablo cried, pleading, "Sir, please, I'm still little. My mom's waiting for me." Luis sat beside him, smiling, and said, "Your mom? What's she doing right now?" "Crying for you." "Nah, kid. Your mom don't even know where you are. Nobody's thinking of you." Pablo shouted, "You're lying." Luis clapped a hand over his mouth and said, "Quiet. If you're quiet, it hurts less." Luis abused Pablo, tortured him, and ultimately strangled him. This time, he left the body in the ravine and went back to town, slept in a cheap hotel, and headed to the next city in the morning. And so it went. Every few weeks, Luis would find a new victim. He moved through different Colombian towns: Pereira, Armenia, Tunja, Bogotá, Cali, always with a new name, a new face. He knew staying too long in one place would raise suspicion, so he kept moving. His bag held extra clothes, a few pairs of glasses, fake mustaches and beards, rope, a knife, and a Bible. He looked at himself in the mirror every morning and decided who he was going to be that day. One of the most horrifying victims of Luis was a boy named Diego, 11 years old, in the city of Toribio. Diego was a smart kid. He went to school, but his family was so poor that he had to work in the afternoons to help out. One day, Luis, this time introducing himself as Francisco, saw him on the street. Luis walked up and said, "Hey kid, want to make some money? I need someone to help me carry some packages." Diego said, "How much do you pay?" Luis said, 5,000 pesos for a few hours. Diego thought about it. That amount of money would really help his family. So he said, "Okay." Luis took him to an old warehouse outside the city. When they got there, Diego noticed there were no packages. He looked at Luis and said, "Where are the packages?" Luis closed the door, turned around, and said, "The packages don't matter anymore." Diego started stepping back. He knew something was wrong. He ran toward the door, but Luis blocked him. Diego shouted, "Let me go! Help!" Luis grabbed him from behind, put his hand over Diego's mouth, and dragged him into the corner of the warehouse. Diego struggled. He was stronger than the previous victims. He kicked, punched, and fought back. At one point, he even managed to hit Luis in the face. Luis got angry. He threw Diego down and started punching him over and over until Diego couldn't fight anymore. Then Luis tied his hands and feet and started torturing him. He cut Diego's body with a knife, beat him, and then assaulted him. All that time, Diego begged. He said, "Please, I have a family. My mom's waiting for me. My dad's waiting for me. Please, let me go." But Luis only said, "Everyone's always waiting, but no one comes. No one ever comes." After Luis finished, he wrapped the rope around Diego's neck and strangled him. But this time, Luis did something else too. He took the knife and carved words into Diego's body. Words the police later couldn't understand. Then he left the body inside the warehouse and walked away. He knew the body would be found soon. He didn't care. He even wanted it to be found. He wanted people to be scared. And people were scared. News about Diego's murder was published in the newspapers. His mother cried on TV, begging for the killer to be found. But the police had no clue. They thought it was just some random murder. Maybe a junkie. Maybe a crazy guy. They didn't know this was just one of dozens of murders. And the killer was still out there hunting. Over the years, Luis learned how to escape the police. He never killed twice in the same city. He was never seen with his victims in public. He always paid cash, never used checks or cards. After each murder, he burned his clothes and changed his shoes. He knew if he wanted to survive, he had to be professional. And he became professional. He was a killer who moved like a shadow without anyone noticing him. In the 80s and early 90s, he killed more than 100 children, and no one even knew. A serial killer was active in Colombia. His victims were street kids. Kids nobody cared about. Society had forgotten them, and Luis used that to keep going. But Luis wasn't just a cold, heartless monster. Sometimes he talked to his victims before killing them. He asked about their lives, their dreams, and sometimes, when they told him how scared they were, Luis cried. Yeah, he actually cried. But then he still killed them, because in Luis's head, what he was doing felt right. He believed he was saving those kids from pain, freeing them from their hard lives. He told himself he was doing something good, and that lie gave him permission to keep on killing. In 1995, Luis arrived in the city of Pereira. This city was one of the major cities in Colombia's coffee-growing region, a place where green plantations stretched as far as the eye could see. But in the city center, poverty and misery reigned like everywhere else in Colombia. This time, Luis had introduced himself as Padre Luis, a young priest who had come from Bogota to help underprivileged children. He wore a black priest's robe, a cross hung around his neck. and he always carried an old Bible in his hand. His first few days, he just sat in the park and talked with the children. He gave them candy, asked them their names, where they lived. The children began to trust him. One of those children was a boy named Andres, 13 years old. Andres was a boy whose family lived in a slum area. His father was a construction worker, and his mother was a housewife. But Andres had run away from home because his father always beat him. He now lived on the streets and survived by petty theft. Luis spent several days with Andres. He bought him food, talked with him, even taught him to read. Andres thought that Padre Luis was a truly good man. One day, Luis said to Andres, "My son, I know a place outside the city, a small house that belongs to the church. You can stay there, work, and start a better life." Andres' eyes lit up. He said, "Really? I won't have to sleep on the street anymore?" Luis smiled and said, "No." They set out the next morning. They took a bus towards a small village. After getting off, Luis said they had to walk a bit. Andres didn't question it. He just walked with Luis. They left the main road and entered a forest path. It was getting dark, and Andres began to feel worried. Andres turned and looked at Luis. He said, "Padre, this isn't a house." Luis's smile disappeared. He approached Andres and said, "No, my son, this isn't a house. This is where you must stay." Andres understood. He started to run, but Luis was fast. He caught Andres and threw him to the ground. Andres screamed, "You're not a priest, you're a liar." Luis laughed. He said, "No, my son, I'm not a priest. I'm something else." He took a rope from his bag and tied Andres' hands and feet. Andres was crying and saying, "Please, I trusted you. You said you wanted to help me." Luis sat down next to him, stroked his hair, and said, "I am helping you. You were living on the street, hungry, cold. No one paid attention to you. But now, I'm paying attention to you. I see you." Andres stared at Luis. He couldn't believe that the same man who had smiled at him a few days ago was now saying these things. He said, "You're crazy. You're sick." Luis laughed and said, "Maybe, but it doesn't matter, because after I'm done with you, no one will know what happened. You'll just become another street kid who disappeared." And then Luis began. He tortured Andres, cut him with a knife, beat him. Andres begged, screamed, but Luis continued. He said, "This is good for you. This saves you from the pain of the world." Then he raped Andres, and all the while, Andres cried and called out his mother's name. But there was no one to hear. When Luis finished, he wrapped the rope around Andres' neck. Andres looked at him, his eyes full of tears, and said, "Why? What did I do to you?" Luis was silent for a moment. Then he said, "You did nothing, but the world did things to you. The world left you alone, forgot you, and I'm just finishing what the world started." And then he pulled tight. Andres struggled, moved his hands, but the rope tightened further. A few seconds later, he no longer moved. Luis took a deep breath. He stood up, looked at Andres's body, and then started digging a hole. He dug the soil with his hands, pushed the leaves aside, and threw the body in. He covered it with soil and then placed a few stones on top so animals wouldn't dig it up. Then he picked up his bag and left. He returned to the city, went to his hotel, took a shower, and slept. That night, like the nights before, he had no nightmares. But Andres' story had another ending. Andres' mother, Mrs. Maria, when she realized her son hadn't come home for several days, called the police. A police said she had to wait 48 hours. Maria waited, but Andres didn't return. She went to the streets, to the parks, to everywhere she thought her son might be. Showed a photo of Andres to the street children and asked, "Have you seen this boy?" One of the children said, "Yes, Andres was with a priest a few days ago, a good man. He said he wanted to help Andres." Maria asked, "Where is this priest?" The child said, "I don't know. I haven't seen him since." Maria told the police, but the police didn't take it very seriously. They thought Andres had just gone off with a man who gave him work, and maybe he'd be back in a few weeks. But Andres didn't return. His body was found 3 months later, when a farmer was looking for trees in the forest. He smelled a bad odor, approached, and saw Andres's half-rotten corpse. The police came, took the body, and the investigation began. But there were no clues. No fingerprints, no evidence, just a body and a mother with a broken heart. After killing Andres, Luis went to the next city, this time to Armenia. There he found a 9-year-old boy named Carlos. Carlos was a boy who lived with his grandmother because his parents had been killed in the Civil War. His grandmother was very old and couldn't take care of him. So Carlos spent most of his time on the streets. Luis saw him in a square, playing with other children. Luis approached, smiled, and said, "Hello, my son. What's your name?" Carlos said, "Carlos." Luis said, "Carlos, that's a nice name. Do you want to get some ice cream?" Carlos looked at the other children. They nodded their heads for him to go. Carlos went with Luis. They went to a shop. Luis bought him ice cream and then said, "Carlos, I have a job for you. Do you want to come?" Carlos asked, "What job?" Luis said, "Simple work. You just need to help me move some things. I'll pay good money." Carlos thought. He needed money. His grandmother was sick and needed medicine. Luis took him to the outskirts of the city. They walked until they reached an abandoned building. Luis said, "This is it. Come in." Carlos entered. The building was dark, smelled damp. The walls were broken. Carlos asked, "What do we need to move?" Luis closed the door. He turned and looked at Carlos. His smile was gone. He said, "Nothing. I just wanted a quiet place." Carlos realized something was wrong. He ran towards the door, but Luis blocked him. Carlos started hitting Luis, kicking, but he was small. he didn't have the strength. Luis threw him to the ground, tied his hands, and began. Carlos screamed, cried, said, "My grandmother is waiting for me. Please let me go." But Luis said, "Your grandmother is too old to figure out where you are. No one is coming for you." Luis captured Carlos and ended his life in a brutal act. But this time, Luis did something different. He left Carlos's body in the same building, and before walking away, he wrote on the wall, in red letters, "God forgive." That message confused the police. They thought maybe the killer felt guilt. Maybe he was a religious man, torn between faith and sin. But the truth was far darker. Luis wasn't feeling guilty. He was playing a game. He wanted to trick the investigators, to make them believe they were chasing a madman and not a professional killer. And Luis's game worked. The police were finding children's bodies in different cities, but no one saw a connection between them. Each city thought it was a local murder, a drug addict, a madman, an accident. No one thought that a serial killer was moving throughout Colombia, killing children. And the reason was simple. The victims were street children, people who had no value to the system. People who, even when they disappeared, no one looked for them. Luis saw this indifference and used it. He grew bolder every day. Sometimes he would find 2 or 3 victims in one city. He no longer just took them to the forests, but to abandoned buildings, warehouses, even cheap hotels. He learned how to be faster, how to leave fewer traces. He learned how, after each murder, to burn his clothes, throw away his shoes, and go to the next city with a new identity. Another of Luis' victims was a boy named Miguel, 12 years old, in the city of Tunja. Miguel was a boy whose family had a car accident on a rainy day, and everyone died except Miguel. After that accident, he went to his uncle's house, but his uncle didn't want him. So Miguel ran away and lived on the streets. He was a quiet and sad boy, always sitting alone and looking at the sky. Luis saw him one evening in a park. He approached and said, "Hello, my son. Why are you so sad?" Miguel looked at him and said, "My family died." Luis sat down next to him, put a hand on his shoulder, and said, "I'm sorry. I know how you feel. I also lost my family." Miguel looked at Luis. For the first time, someone was sympathizing with him. Luis said, "Miguel, do you want to come with me? I know a place where you can stay. Be safe." Miguel thought he needed a safe place. He said, "Okay. ... Luis took him to the outskirts of the city, to a mountain path. They walked on foot. Miguel asked, "How much further do we have to go?" Luis said, "We're close." But when they reached a ravine, Luis stopped. Miguel turned and saw Luis taking rope out of his bag. Miguel said, "What are you doing?" Luis said, "I want to help you, Miguel. I want to end your pain." Miguel started to run, but Luis was faster. He caught Miguel, threw him to the ground, and tied his hands. Miguel was crying and saying, "I trusted you. Why are you doing this?" Luis sat next to him, looked into his eyes, and said, "Because you're in pain, Miguel. You think about your family every day. You wish you were with them. and I want to fulfill that wish for you. I want to send you to them." Miguel looked at Luis with tearful eyes and said softly, "No, I don't want to die. I want to live." But Luis replied, "For what, Miguel? To live on the street? To be hungry, cold, and alone? This isn't life. I'm helping you." Then, darkness followed. What happened next was cruel, something no one should ever experience. Miguel's cries echoed into the night, calling for his mother, until everything went silent. When it was over, Luis left the lifeless boy in the ravine and walked away. He went back to the city, bought a bus ticket, and set off for a new place, Cali, one of the largest cities in Colombia. He knew Cali had many street children, and in his twisted mind, that meant opportunity. Over the next 6 months, Luis continued his crimes, thinking he was untouchable. He believed the police would never find him. He felt powerful, invincible. But that arrogance, that false confidence, would one day become his downfall. It was 1998 when Luis arrived in the city of Villavicencio. This city was called the Gateway to the Amazon rainforest, where the air was hot and humid and the streets were full of dust. This time, Luis had introduced himself as Don Diego, a retired teacher who wanted to teach poor children. He wore glasses, had cut his hair short, and carried an old leather bag containing textbooks. One morning he went to a park where street children gathered. There he saw a 10-year-old boy named Eduardo. Eduardo was a boy whose mother had abandoned him years ago, and whose father was an addict. Eduardo lived on the streets, sniffed glue, and survived by petty theft. Luis approached him, smiled, and said, "Hello, my son. What's your name?" Eduardo looked at him, his eyes red from the glue. He said, "Eduardo." Luis said, "Eduardo has beautiful stories. Do you want me to read to you?" Eduardo thought and said, "Okay." They sat on a bench, and Luis began to read. Eduardo listened. For the first time in a long while, he felt calm. Luis spent several days with Eduardo. He bought him food, read books to him, even bought him new clothes. Eduardo began to trust Luis. He thought Don Diego was a good man, a man who truly wanted to help him. But one day, Luis said to Eduardo, "My son, I know a place outside the city, a farm where you can stay and work. Do you want to come?" Eduardo thought he needed a safe place, a shelter. He said, "Okay." The next morning, they set off. They took a bus to a small village. After getting off, Luis said they had to walk. Eduardo didn't question it. He just went with him. They left the road and entered a forest path. The further they walked, the denser the forest became. Eduardo began to feel worried. He asked, "Don Diego, how much further do we have to go?" Luis said, "We're close. Be patient." After half an hour, Luis stopped. They were in the middle of the forest. Eduardo turned and saw Luis taking rope out of his bag. Eduardo said, "What are you doing?" Luis smiled, but the smile was no longer kind. He said, "Eduardo, the time has come." Eduardo started to run, but his legs were weak from malnutrition and glue. Luis easily caught him, threw him to the ground, and tied his hands. Eduardo was crying and saying, "Why? I trusted you. You said you wanted to help me." Luis sat next to him, stroked his head, and said, "Eduardo, I am helping you. You don't understand now, but one day you will. You were in a life full of pain and suffering, but I'm ending that pain." Eduardo screamed, "I don't want to die. I want to live." But Luis said, "For what? To sniff glue every day? To go to sleep hungry every night? No, Eduardo, this isn't life." And then Luis began. He tortured Eduardo, cut him with a knife, beat him, raped him. Eduardo begged, screamed, but Luis continued. And finally, he wrapped the rope around Eduardo's neck and pulled tight. Eduardo struggled, but a few seconds later, it was over. Luis took a deep breath. He stood up, looked at Eduardo's body, and then started digging a hole. But this time, something was different. Luis felt tired. Not physically tired, but spiritually tired. He asked himself, and Luis thought, "Why can't I be like them? Why do I have to be this monster?" But these thoughts had come too late. Luis was now a serial killer, a monster who couldn't stop. He knew he had to continue because it was the only thing he knew how to do. In the following months, Luis went to other cities. He went to Pasto, to Cucuta, to Barrancabermeja. Wherever he went, he found victims. He had even forgotten the number of his victims. 60, 70, 80. He didn't know. He only knew he had to continue. One of his last victims before his capture was a boy named Jaime, 11 years old, in the city of Bogota. Jaime was a boy whose family had been evicted from their home on a rainy day because they couldn't pay the rent. They lived on the streets for a few months. But then Jaime's mother got sick and died. His father also left Jaime after the mother's death. Jaime was left alone, an 11-year-old child on the streets of Bogota. Luis saw him at a bus station. Jaime was sitting on the ground, his head leaning against the wall and crying. Luis approached, sat next to him, and said, "Why are you crying, my son?" Jaime looked at him. Tears were on his face, and he said, "My mom died, my dad left, I'm alone." Luis put a hand on his shoulder and said, "I'm sorry. Do you want to come with me? I can help you." Jaime looked at Luis. He was tired, hungry, alone. He just wanted someone to pay attention to him, someone to say that everything would be okay. He said, "Okay." Luis took him to a cheap hotel. He got a room, took Jaime upstairs, and bought him food. Jaime ate and then lay down on the bed. It had been a long time since he had slept on a bed. Luis sat on a chair and looked at him. Jaime said, "Thank you, sir. You're very kind." Luis smiled, but in his heart, he knew this kindness was just a mask. Night fell. Jamie slept. Luis waited for him to fall into a deep sleep. Then he got up, took rope from his bag, and went towards the bed. He quietly tied Jamie's hands and feet. Jamie woke up. His eyes opened, and he saw Luis standing over him. He started to scream, but Luis put his hand over his mouth. Jamie struggled, tried to escape, but couldn't. Luis said, "Be calm, Jamie. If you're calm, it will be over sooner." Jamie was crying, tears streaming down his face. And he looked at Luis with eyes full of fear and disbelief. He couldn't believe that the same man who had given him food a few hours ago was now doing this. Luis tortured Jamie. He cut his body with a knife, beat him, raped him. Jamie begged, said, "Please, I still want to live. I want to grow up, have a life." But Luis said, "You have no life, Jamie. You're just a street kid that no one cares about. But I care about you. I'm giving you freedom." And then he wrapped the rope around Jaime's neck and pulled tight. Jaime struggled, moved his hands, thrashed his head around, but Luis pulled tighter, harder and harder. And a few seconds later, Jaime no longer moved. Luis untied the rope, looked at Jaime's body, and for the first time, tears streamed from his eyes. He sat on the floor, put his head in his hands, and cried. He didn't know why he was crying. Maybe from exhaustion, maybe from regret, or maybe just because he knew this had to end. He stood up, wrapped Jaime's body in a blanket, took it out of the hotel, and went to the outskirts of the city. He left the body in a remote location, and then returned to the city. But this time, Luis made a mistake. He left fingerprints in the hotel. A piece of his clothing fell off. And most importantly, someone saw him. A woman in the neighboring room had heard Jaime's screams at night. She told the hotel manager, and the manager called the police. The police came, examined the room, found fingerprints, found the piece of fabric, and for the first time, they had a real clue. They began reviewing other cases of children killed throughout Colombia. And they realized there was a pattern. One of the street children in Bogota told the police he had seen a suspicious man, a man who always talked to children, gave them food, and then they disappeared. The police asked that child to describe the man, and the child described a middle-aged man, average height, dark hair, always wore simple. With this description, the police began searching the city. They went to parks, bus stations, and markets. And one day, one of the police officers saw Luis. He was talking to a young boy, and the officer realized this was the man they were looking for. He informed his colleagues, and they began pursuing Luis. Luis realized he was being followed. He let go of the boy's hand and started running. The police ran after him through the alleys of Bogota. Luis was fast. He knew that if he was caught, everything would be over. He ran, jumped over a wall, and went into an abandoned building. But the police followed him. They surrounded the building. Luis was hiding inside the building, panting, his heart racing. He knew there was no escape left. He looked at the window, The police were outside, waiting. He looked at the door. The police were there too. He was trapped. One of the police officers shouted through a megaphone, "Luis Alfredo Garavito, surrender!" People had gathered in the street. They looked at Luis. Some cursed him. Some threw stones. Luis had his head down. He didn't want to look into their eyes. The police put him in a car and took him to the police station. There, they began the interrogation. But Luis didn't speak. He just sat, remained silent, and stared at the wall. The police officers were angry. They wanted a confession. They wanted to know how many he had killed, where the bodies were. But Luis remained silent. This silence continued for several days until one of the police psychologists came and spoke with Luis. He said to Luis, "Luis, I want to help you, but to help you, you need to talk to me." Luis looked at him, and for the first time, he spoke. He said, "You can't help me. No one can." The psychologist asked, "Why did you do these things, Luis? Why did you kill those children?" Luis was silent for a moment, then said, "Because I was a child myself that no one cared about. I was tortured, raped, beaten, and no one helped me. And I thought if I couldn't be saved, then no one else could either. I thought I was helping those children. I was freeing them from pain." The psychologist looked at Luis. He knew Luis was a sick man, a man who had been damaged since childhood and never received treatment. But he also knew that Luis had to answer for his crimes. He had to be punished for his atrocities. After a few days, Luis began to confess. He told the police how many he had killed, where he had left the bodies, how he had deceived them. He said he had killed over 130 children, but he didn't know the exact number. The police were shocked. They couldn't believe that one person had committed so many murders without anyone noticing. The police began searching the locations Luis had mentioned. They went to forests, ravines, abandoned buildings, and they found the bodies. Half-rotten corpses, skeletal remains, bodies of children who never got the chance to live. Each time a body was found, families cried, mothers screamed, fathers fell silent, and all of Colombia was horrified. News of Luis's arrest spread across all Colombian media. Newspapers called him the monster of Colombia. Television stations broadcast videos of him. People in the streets cursed his name. Luis had become the most infamous serial killer in Colombian history, and perhaps one of the most notorious killers in world history. The interrogations of Luis continued at the Bogotá police station. Every day, new officers came. Every day, they asked new questions. They wanted to know why, how, where, when. But Luis answered slowly, as if he were talking about the weather, not about the murder of hundreds of children. One of the officers, Captain Rodrigo Martinez, was in charge of the main interrogation. He was a 50-year-old man with gray hair and eyes that held the fatigue of years of police work. The first day he sat facing Luis, he said to him, "Do you know how many families you destroyed? How many mothers you left grieving?" Luis looked at him, gave a faint smile, and said, Those families had already destroyed those children themselves. I just finished what they had started. Rodrigo became angry. He slammed his fist on the table and said, "You have no right to judge. You have no right to decide who should die and who shouldn't." Luis shook his head and said, "You're right. I had no right. But no one else was doing it either. Those children were dying on the streets from hunger, from cold, from glue. No one cared about them. Even you, the police, when one of them went missing, you wouldn't even file a report." Rodrigo fell silent because he knew Luis was telling the truth. The reality was that the system didn't care about street children, and this very indifference had allowed Luis to continue his work for years. Rodrigo took a deep breath and said, "Okay, let's start from the beginning. Who was your first victim?" Luis thought for a moment, then said, "I don't remember his name. He was a boy, about 10 years old, in the city of Sevilla. That was a long time ago, maybe 20 years. Rodrigo said, 20 years? You did this for 20 years and no one noticed? Luis smiled and said, "I was professional. I knew how to hide myself, how not to leave traces." Rodrigo asked, "How did you deceive those children?" Luis said, "It was simple. I smiled at them, gave them food, paid attention to them, something no one else gave them, and they trusted me." Rodrigo said, "And then what?" Luis said, "Then I took them to remote places, forests, ravines, abandoned buildings, and there I did what I had to do." Rodrigo asked, "What? Torture? Rape? Murder?" Luis fell silent, lowered his head. Rodrigo shouted, "Answer me! What did you do to those children?" Luis said quietly, "All the things you said. I tortured them because I wanted to show them the pain I had endured. I raped them because I wanted to see what they felt, the same feeling I had at 8 years old. And then I killed them because I wanted their pain to end." Rodrigo stared at Luis. He couldn't believe that a human could speak so coldly and emotionlessly about killing children. He asked, "Did you never feel remorse?" Luis said, "Sometimes, yes. Sometimes when I looked at them, when I heard their pleas, I felt remorse. But then I remembered that the world had wronged them, not me. I was just finishing what the world had started." Rodrigo stood up, went to the window, looked outside. He was tired, angry, hopeless. He turned back and said to Luis, "Each time a body was found, the forensic team took it away for identification. And each time a body was identified, a family was notified. And those families cried, screamed, fell to the ground. Some mothers fainted. Some fathers punched walls. And everyone hated Luis. One of the mothers, Mrs. Sarah, Andres' mother, when she learned her son's body had been found, came to the police station. She wanted to see Luis. She wanted to tell him something. The police initially objected, but then allowed it. Sarah entered the interrogation room, where Luis was sitting. She looked at Luis, tears gathered in her eyes, and said, "Why? Why did you kill my son? He had done nothing to you." Luis looked at her, He couldn't say anything. Sarah continued, Andres was a good boy. He just wanted a better life. He trusted you, and you took his life. Luis said quietly, I'm sorry. Sarah screamed, Sorry? Is that all you have to say? You killed my son. You destroyed my life. And you just say you're sorry? Luis lowered his head. He didn't know what to say, because no words could compensate for the pain that mother was enduring. Sarah approached him, slapped his face, and said, I hope you burn in hell. I hope you spend every day of your life in pain, just like I am spending mine. And then she left the room, crying. Luis remained in the room, his head on the table, crying. For the first time since his arrest, he felt genuine remorse. He realized that what he had done was not help, not salvation, but only endless pain and suffering. In the following days, Luis spoke with more psychologists. They tried to understand why he had done these things. What was going through his mind? One psychologist, Dr. Manuela Rodriguez, said to Louis, I want to know about your childhood. What happened that brought you to this point? Louis took a deep breath and began to tell his story. He talked about his father, about the beatings he endured, about his mother who remained silent. He talked about the day 3 men raped him, and how after that day, everything changed. He said, I died that day. The child I was died that day, and something else came in its place, something dark and dangerous. Dr. Manuela said, and you thought by killing those children, you could escape your own pain? Louis said, no, I thought I was saving those children from pain. But now I understand I was wrong. I only increased their pain. Dr. Manuela took notes and said, Luis, you are a damaged individual. Someone who never received help. But that doesn't justify what you did. You chose to harm others, and now you must be held accountable. Luis nodded and said, I know, and I'm ready to be held accountable. The interrogations continued for months. Luis told the police exactly where he had left the bodies, on which days, at what times. His memory was good. He remembered almost everything. He even gave details about some of the victims. Their names, their ages, their last words. And every time he gave these details, the police officers felt nauseated. One officer, Major Carla Vega, one day after a difficult interrogation session, came out of the room and vomited. She couldn't bear how Luis spoke coldly about torturing and killing children. She said to Rodrigo, I can't continue this anymore. This man is a monster. Rodrigo put a hand on her shoulder and said, I know, but we must continue. We must bring justice for those children and their families. And they continued. They collected all the information Luis provided, found all the bodies, recorded all the evidence. And finally, after 6 months of investigation, the case was ready for trial. News of Luis's trial spread throughout Colombia. People wanted to see how this monster would be tried, how he would answer for his crimes. The court decided the trial would be public, so everyone could see. And on the first day of the trial, hundreds of people gathered in front of the courthouse. Some were victims' families, some were just curious. Luis entered the courtroom, in an orange prison uniform. He was handcuffed and shackled, with 2 guards beside him. He kept his head down, not wanting to look anyone in the eye. When he sat in the defendant's chair, the entire courtroom fell silent. Everyone stared at him, at the man who had killed hundreds of children. The judge, Mr. Ramos, a 60-year-old man with stern eyes, opened the session. He said, "Luis Alfredo Garavito Cubillos, you are accused of the murder of 138 children, torture, child rape, and other crimes. Do you plead guilty to these charges?" Luis stood up, looked at the judge, and said, "Yes, I plead guilty." The courtroom erupted in uproar. People began shouting. Some were crying. The judge banged his gavel on the desk and said, "Silence! Silence!" The prosecutor, Miss Lucia Mendoza, stood up and began presenting the evidence. She showed photos of the bodies, read forensic reports, presented testimonies from families. Each piece of evidence was more painful than the last. People in the courtroom cried. Some could no longer bear it and left the room to rape them. "You are a monster, and you must receive the harshest punishment." Luis kept his head down and said nothing. Then his lawyer, Mr. Sanchez, stood up. He tried to defend Luis, saying that Luis was a sick individual, damaged since childhood, and should be sent to a mental hospital instead of prison. But no one accepted his arguments. People shouted, "Execute him! Execute him!" The judge banged his gavel again and said, "Silence! This is a court of law, not an execution ground." Then he said to Luis, "Mr. Garavito, do you have anything to say before the sentence is pronounced?" Luis stood up slowly, looked around the courtroom, at the families present, and said, "I want to say that I'm sorry. I know this word doesn't fix anything, but I am truly sorry. I was a sick man, a man broken since childhood. But that doesn't justify what I did. I chose to do these things, and now I am ready to be punished." Some mothers in the courtroom screamed, "Sorry? Is that all you have to say? You killed my son. You destroyed my life." Luis lowered his head and sat down. After a few minutes of silence, the judge pronounced the sentence. He said, "Luis Alfredo Garavito Cubillos, given the horrific crimes you have committed, this court sentences you to the maximum penalty possible under Colombian law. You are sentenced to 1,853 years in prison. However, under Colombian law, the maximum time for serving a sentence is 40 years. You will remain in prison for the rest of your life with no possibility of parole." The courtroom erupted in uproar. Some were happy that Luis had been punished. Others were angry that he wasn't executed. But Colombian law did not have the death penalty, so this was the maximum punishment. Luis stood up. The guards took him out of the courtroom. People cursed behind him, threw things. Luis walked with his head down. He knew his life was over. He knew he would never see freedom again. He was taken to La Picota prison. one of the toughest prisons in Colombia. There, he was placed in solitary confinement for his own safety. Because they feared other inmates would kill him, he didn't speak with any other inmates. Because everyone hated him. Even murderers and thieves hated him. Because someone who kills children is despised, even in prison. And he woke up every night in a cold sweat, unable to sleep until morning. I can give you medication to reduce the nightmares. But Luis shook his head and said, "No, I don't want to. I deserve these nightmares. It's the only thing that can somewhat compensate for the pain I caused those children." And Luis continued living in torment. He woke up every day with guilt and slept every night with nightmares. And this continued until the end of his life. In 2003, Luis became ill in prison. He started coughing up blood, and had a fever. The prison doctors examined him and diagnosed him with lung cancer. The disease was advanced and incurable. They told Luis he might only have a few months left to live. When Luis heard this news, he didn't show any particular reaction. He just nodded his head and said, "Okay," as if he was waiting for this moment, as if he knew his time had come. The doctor asked, "Do you want us to try to treat you? Chemotherapy might help." But Luis said, "No, I don't want to. Let it run its course." News of Luis's illness reached outside the prison. Some of the victims' families were happy. They said, "It's good that he's dying. He deserves it." But others were angry. They said he should suffer more. Death is an easy way out for him. In the last months of his life, Luis thought more about his past. He remembered the day he was 8 years old, and 3 men raped him. He remembered his father beating him. He remembered his mother staying silent. He thought, if those things hadn't happened, would I still have done these things? But he didn't know the answer. One day, the prison chaplain, Padre Agustin, came to visit Luis. He introduced himself and said, "My son, I heard you are sick. I wanted to see if I could help you." Luis looked at him and said, "You're a priest?" The Padre said, "Yes." Luis laughed, a bitter laugh, and said, "I myself pretended to be a priest for years. I deceived children in priest's clothing. And now a real priest has come to help me?" Padre Agustin sat on the chair next to Luis's bed and said, "Luis, I know what you did. I know you committed horrific crimes. But I am not here to judge you. I am here to help you find peace before your death." Luis looked at the ceiling and said, "Peace? I don't deserve peace. I deserve torment." The Padre said, "God forgives, Luis. If you are truly repentant, God can forgive you." Luis turned his head and looked at the Padre. He said, "I'm repentant, but this repentance doesn't change anything. Those children died. Those families were destroyed. No forgiveness or absolution can bring that back." Padre Agustin placed a hand on Luis's hand and said, "You are right, but forgiveness is for you, not for them. Forgiveness can give you peace. It can allow you to come to terms with yourself." Luis thought for a moment, then said, "I don't know how to come to terms with myself. I hear their voices every night. I see their faces every night." The padre said, "Then pray, Luis. Pray that God gives you the strength to endure." Luis said, "I haven't prayed in years." The padre said, "It's never too late." And from that day on, Padre Agustin came to see Luis every day. They talked together, sometimes prayed, sometimes just remained silent. Luis gradually began to feel a little peace, not complete peace, but a little. One day, Luis said to the padre, "I want to write letters to the victims' families. I want to tell them how sorry I am." The padre said, "That is a good thing, Luis. It might not help, but at least you tried." Luis began writing the letters. He wrote a letter to every family he knew. In the letters he wrote, "I know that no words can compensate for the pain I caused you. I know that you can never forgive me. But I want you to know that I live with guilt every day, and this guilt is a torment that never ends. I am sorry, truly sorry, from the bottom of my heart." The letters were sent. Some families replied. Some said, "We will never forgive you." Some said, "We hope you burn in hell." And some said nothing. Luis didn't expect a positive response. He just wanted to say that he was sorry. Months passed, and Luis's illness worsened. He could no longer get out of bed. His body was weak, and the pain was great. The doctors gave him painkillers, but the pain was still there. One day, Luis said to Padre Agustin, "I think my time is near." The padre said, "Yes, I think you are right." Luis said, "I am afraid. I don't know what happens after death." The padre took his hand and said, "God is with you, Luis. If you are truly repentant, God will have mercy on you." Luis said, "I hope you are right." And one night, in the silence of the prison, Luis Alfredo Garavito Cubillos, the man who had killed over 130 children, drew his last breath. He died in his sleep, without pain, without a scream. Just one last breath, and then silence. News of Luis's death spread quickly. Some were happy. Some said, "At least he can't hurt anyone anymore." Others were angry. They said, "He died too easily. He should have suffered more." Luis's body wasn't given to anyone because no one wanted him. He was buried in the prison cemetery without ceremony, without a headstone, just a hole and a number. And so the life of Luis Alfredo Garavito, the monster of Colombia, came to an end. But the story didn't end. The story of the victims, the story of the families, the story of pain that never heals continues. Mothers who still cry, fathers who are still angry, brothers and sisters who still remember. And every day they wake up with this question: why? And the answer is never found, because some questions have no answers. Some pains never heal, and some monsters, even after death, remain alive in people's minds. Has society changed? Unfortunately, the answer is no. There are still thousands of street children in Colombia and around the world. Still thousands of orphaned, hungry, lonely children. And still monsters like Luis wait in the shadows. And this bitter truth must make us think. It must compel us to act. Because if we don't think about those children, if we don't support them, if we don't create a system that protects them, tragedies like that of Luis, and this is the responsibility of all of us. The responsibility of governments, of society, of every individual. We must be better. We must be vigilant. We must be the voice for those children who have no voice. This is the story of Luis Alfredo Garavito, the monster of Colombia, the killer who murdered over 130 innocent children. A story that shows how a human can turn into a monster, how society's indifference can lead to tragedy, and how pain and suffering can affect generations. But most of all, this story is a reminder that we must care for our children. We must value them. We must provide a safe environment for them. Because if we don't do this, if we forget them, if we let them wander the streets, more monsters like Luis will emerge, and more innocent blood will be shed. This is the only way we can prevent such tragedies from repeating. Not through revenge, not through violence, but through care, through attention, through building a society where no child is forgotten. And perhaps, just perhaps, if we do this, the souls of those 138 children that Luis killed can find peace. Perhaps they can forgive, not Luis, but the society that forgot them. This is the end of the story of Luis Alfredo Garavito. But I hope it is the beginning of a change, the beginning of a better society, a safer world, a place where no child has to live on the streets, a place where no child becomes prey to a monster. Now let's return to more details about how Luis was captured and how the police finally managed to track him down. This part of the story shows how a small mistake can expose a serial killer and how police perseverance ultimately paid off. The story began in late 1997 when the number of children's bodies found in various Colombian cities began to increase. At first, no connection was seen between these bodies because they were found in different cities and local police were investigating independently. But a young detective named Pablo Guarin, who worked in the city of Pereira, began to see a pattern in these murders. Pablo was reviewing various case files one night. He looked at the details, the victims' ages, their gender, the location where the bodies were found, the method of killing. And he noticed that almost all the victims were boys, between 8 and 13 years old, all found in remote locations, and all strangled with a rope. These similarities couldn't be coincidental. Pablo spoke with his boss, Major Martinez. He said, "I think we're dealing with a serial killer." Martinez was initially skeptical. He said, "A serial killer? In Colombia? That's something that only happens in America." Martinez finally agreed. They began contacting police in other cities, Bogota, Cali, Armenia, Tunja, Villavicencio, and the responses they received were shocking. Each city had dozens of similar cases, children's bodies killed using the same method. When they compiled all these cases, the number reached over 80. The Colombian Federal Police got involved. They formed a special team to investigate this serial killer. The team included the best detectives, criminal psychologists, and forensic experts. They began analyzing all the evidence, looking for any small clue that could help them. One of the first things they discovered was that the killer was always on the move. He never committed more than 2 or 3 murders in one city before moving on. This indicated he was an intelligent and aware individual who knew how to evade the police. Also, evidence showed the killer used different identities, sometimes presenting himself as a priest, sometimes as a vendor, sometimes as a teacher. Criminal psychologists built a profile of the killer. They said he was likely a man between 30 and 50 years old, who had been abused himself as a child, who had serious psychological problems, and who gained a sense of power and control from killing children. They also said he was likely a loner, without family or close friends. But all this information still wasn't enough. They still didn't know who the killer was, where he was, or how to find him, until that small mistake happened. In April 1999, Luis was in Bogota. He had taken a boy named Jaime to a hotel and killed him there. But this time, he made a mistake. He left a piece of his clothing in the hotel room and also left fingerprints on the door handle, and a woman in the neighboring room had heard screams and told the hotel manager. The police came, examined the room, collected evidence. Luis's fingerprints were in the police database because he had been arrested years earlier for a minor theft. The police checked the fingerprints, and the name Luis Alfredo Garavito Cubillos came up. They immediately began searching for Luis. They sent his photo to all police units in Bogota and told officers to be vigilant. And a few days later, an officer spotted him. Luis was in a park, talking to a young boy. The officer immediately notified his colleagues, and they began to approach. Luis noticed. He knew there was no escape left, but he tried to run anyway. He ran through the alleys. The police chased him. He went into an abandoned building, but the police surrounded the building. And finally, after several hours, Luis surrendered. This notebook was evidence that Luis had been recording his victims. The police took him to the station, and the interrogation began. At first, Luis remained silent. He didn't want to talk. He didn't want to confess. But after a few days, when the police showed him the evidence, when they showed him that notebook, Luis realized there was no escape left, and he began to talk. He confessed to killing over 130 children. He told them where he had left the bodies, how he had deceived them, how he had killed them, and with every word he spoke, the police grew more shocked. They couldn't believe that one person had committed so many crimes without anyone noticing. After Luis's confession, the police began their search. They went to all the locations Luis had mentioned, and they found the bodies. Each body had a story. Each body had a family that had been waiting for it. And each time a body was found, a family's old wound was reopened. When the families learned the killer had been caught, they reacted differently. Some were happy that justice had finally been served. Some were angry that he hadn't been caught sooner. And some could only cry because there was nothing else they could do. One mother, Mrs. Rosa, the mother of a boy named Mateo, who had been killed 5 years earlier, came to the police station when she heard the killer had been caught. She wanted to see her son's body. She wanted to know where he was buried. The police took her to the location Luis had described, and there, under an old tree, they found Mateo's body. When Rosa saw her son's body, she fell to the ground and began to cry. She screamed, "My son, my Mateo," and she cried so much that she lost her voice. Tried to calm her, but how could they? How could they tell a mother who had just found her son after 5 years to be calm? Mateo's body was taken for identification and then returned to the family. Rosa held a small ceremony, just herself and a few friends. They buried Mateo, and Rosa said, "Now you can rest, my son. Your killer has been caught, and he will remain in prison for the rest of his life." But was this real peace? Could Luis's arrest truly heal the pain of these families? The answer is no. Because nothing can bring back a lost child. Nothing can compensate for those lost years. But at least these families now knew what had happened. They knew who the killer was, and they knew he could no longer hurt anyone. And this, perhaps, was the only thing that could give them a little peace. Not complete peace, but a little. A little so they could sleep at night. A little so they could wake up in the morning. A little so they could continue with life, even if that life would never be the same as before. The interrogations of Luis continued, and each day more details were revealed. He told the police how he selected his victims, how he approached them, what he said to gain their trust. He said he always chose children who were alone, whom no one was looking for, who had been rejected by society. One of the detectives, Miss Isabel, who was in charge of part of the interrogation, asked Luis one day, "What were you thinking when you killed those children?" Luis was silent for a moment, then said, "I was thinking of myself, of that 8-year-old boy who was raped, who was beaten, whom no one helped. And I thought I was helping those children. I was stopping their pain." Isabel stared at Luis. She couldn't believe how a human being could justify killing children as help. She said, "You really believed you were helping?" Luis shook his head and said, "At that time, yes, but now I know I was wrong. Now I know I was just a monster." This confession showed that Luis was an individual with complex psychological disorders. Psychologists later diagnosed him with multiple personality disorders, including antisocial personality disorder and impulse control disorder. They also said the abuse he experienced in childhood played a major role in forming these disorders. But these diagnoses couldn't justify his crimes. Although Luis was a sick individual, he had chosen to do these things. He had chosen to harm children, and now he had to be held accountable. One of the painful moments during the interrogation was when Luis spoke about one of his victims, a boy named Santiago. Santiago was a 10-year-old boy whose family had been killed in an attack by paramilitary groups, and he was left alone. He lived on the streets of Bogota, and Luis said, Santiago was a very smart kid. He talked more than other children, asked questions. He asked me my name, where I lived, why I wanted to help him. And I answered, I lied, and he believed me. He wanted to become a policeman one day to help other children. And I told him I was sorry, but it couldn't be. The detective felt nauseated. He couldn't imagine how a 10-year-old boy had been begging for his life, and Luis had told him it couldn't be. Didn't you feel anything, any remorse? Luis said. At that moment, no, but afterwards, yes. Every night I hear Santiago's voice. I hear him begging. These interrogations continued for months, and each time more information was revealed. Luis told the police that sometimes, after a murder, he would return to the crime scene. He would go to his victims' graves, sit there, and talk to them. He would say, I'm sorry, forgive me. I hope you have peace now. This behavior showed that Luis wasn't just a cold, unfeeling killer, but an individual struggling with severe internal conflicts. On one hand, he continued killing children, and on the other hand, he felt guilt and remorse. This conflict was a sign of the complex mental illness he had. Finally, after 6 months of interrogation, the case was complete. All evidence had been collected, all confessions recorded, and the case was ready to be presented to the court. The prosecutor, Miss Lucia Mendoza, announced that this was the largest serial murder case in Colombian history, and perhaps one of the largest in the world. On the first day of the trial, hundreds of people gathered in front of the courthouse. Some held signs that read, "Justice for the victims, execution for the monster. We will never forget." Luis's trial began in October 1999. The court decided the trial would be public, so everyone could. Luis entered the courtroom in an orange prison uniform, handcuffed and shackled. He kept his head down, not wanting to look at anyone. When he sat down, the entire room stared at him. Mothers who had lost their children, fathers who could no longer smile, brothers and sisters who had been orphaned. They were all there, waiting for justice.